I disabled the waiting room because I just wanted that just while you were setting up so that people weren't in beforehand. Um,
Yeah.
and so you have co-host controls. I'm just gonna mute myself and you can go ahead and do your thing. It is already recording.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
How's everyone today? Still got a couple of minutes before we start. Can you all hear me okay? You can go ahead and unmute if you want to, if you can.
Oui,
Joe Donnelly, can you hear me all right?
yes.
Good, very
This is
good.
this is John. I can hear you.
Great. Just double checking. Well, I've got some slides for you today, but most of it, like usual, is going to be me. Here we go. How are you? No, I can see you. So we have a relatively small group today so far. Originally, we were going to have this in person and do a hybrid Zoom, but then it was decided just to Zoom it. So, um, and here we are. This is actually the first Zoom I'm doing in quite a while. You know, everybody is wanting me back in house, but that's fine with me. I like this too. We always had a good experience with that. So it's whoops, 1:31. So I'm going to go ahead and get going, 1:32. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Art Gottlieb, and I've done many semesters of history programming with Edith Wheeler. I'm glad to be to doing another one with you. Famous presidents or notable presidents, I think I called it. So we have 5 sessions. I picked 5 presidents. Today, Andrew Andrew Jackson is quite fascinating to me, even more so than the others, only because of its historical relevance. Um, these topics and the titles were chosen. I chose these well before the election we just had 2 weeks ago. What I've done is I've actually reconsidered some of the ways that I'm going to present some of this today because of the striking overlaps and similarities of some of Jackson's personality and the circumstances of his presidency to the now president-elect Donald J. Trump. I'm not taking any political positions on anything. Even if Trump would have lost, I think that this still would have been an interesting, very interesting presentation, just regarding the fact that um, we've all lived through some pretty interesting political times. Now, for me, I look at history through a number of salient factors. Number one, I was a professional historian for 9 years and have been teaching history classes for the last literally 30 years. But also, in before this history programming thing took off, I also I'm trained and licensed in the helping arts. In other words, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, a licensed master social worker, and I'm also a certified senior advisor. And I have a private practice where I do essentially counseling, psychotherapy with people and their families, etc. So I look at things through the lens of what makes a person tick. So if you have somebody who is a grown adult and they are have a passion about something. They have a point of view. They have a drive. I'm always interested to know where that drive comes from and what made them who they were, or at least believe what they believe, where their passions lie. And we all have these things in our lives. And that certainly is the case with Andrew Jackson and how that all manifested itself into his presidency. Um, Additionally, when I do programming on what I'm going to call current events, right? And I've been doing that for quite some time also. I eased up on it a little bit this year just because things got a little bit nutty with the election and it becomes very, very difficult to have a real conversation with people because of their passions involved of for or against one candidate or the other. I find out what people know or what they think they know about politics. And many people believe that whoever the candidate is, our the kind of tone of our politics and the way politicians are is something that is a recent development, that is some kind of an abhorrent thing that is against American tradition. I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. It is, as you will see in today's program here, American politics have always been full of adversaries, quite pointed adversaries. The only difference really now is that we have such immediate responses to what anyone says because of our social media, our 24/7 news cycle, cable news, and all the rest of that. I think that you're going to find fascinating Andrew Jackson because of not only his personality and what made him tick, but I also want to go into what the times that he lived in were. And I also want to go into our recent past, just the last year or so, talk about, or the last 8 years, and see the similarities in government as we've experienced them. Now, if you want to think about this, who were the presidents before Andrew Jackson, right? This is a relatively young country when Andrew Jackson becomes president of the United States. Right. Now I'm going to give you a timeline and all the rest of that in a minute. Right now, I still just want to go broadly. We had George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, of course, James Madison, James Monroe, of which the town of this library bears its name, and John Quincy Adams. right? So 50 years is a long time into the beginning of the 19th century when Andrew Jackson becomes president. 50 years since the beginning of our nation. I mean, you can just see how many things have gone on in the last 50 years. Right? Where do we get our political understanding anyway? I mean, it's any single person, if you want to ask yourself, I mean, what gave you the point of view that you have as far as whatever your politics are? I mean, I can remember sitting at my parents' table, I mean, in our little apartment in New York, and it was, I listened to my parents talking, and obviously my father who had an opinion and all the rest of this, and the socioeconomic class in which my family of origin grew up. I mean, these things affect us one way or the other. In the case of my father's attitude that went along with his politics, there were two things that drove him. There were number one is that he was a veteran from World War II and also of the Korean War era. So that gave him a certain kind of, military sort of patriotism, if that's what you want to call it. And it was also the fact that my parents ran their own small business. And from that standpoint, they were basically blue collar middle class people and trying to aspire for more. And they always felt like they were the underdogs in a larger world of people who had a little bit more privilege than they were, and nobody was really looking out for them. They didn't have the privilege of being rich. They didn't have the government support of being poor, you see. So you can understand how those sort of things fed to their understanding of what was just and what wasn't just. I mean, you probably have your own version of whatever story it is from your point of view, you see. And so when our country was founded, right, Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, right, the adoption of the United States Constitution, right, what was society like? Right? What was society like? What were the norms? Right? Remember, the average person, whatever an average person is, was maybe they could read, maybe they couldn't read, right? I mean, what kind of news did you have? I mean, today, I mean, I watch the news basically 24 hours a day. Either it's via my smartphone or whatever it is, and I mean, I'm never without that intellectual input. If intellectual is the word you want to use for that. And but back in the day, back in 17, if this was 1780 and you were an average person, what would you be doing? Right? If you were a woman, what would you be doing? If you were a man, what would you be doing? Right? You'd probably be trying to keeping your third child from dying before they were by the time they were 10 years old. You would be feeding your kids. You would be trying to make sure that your crop came in and all the rest of that. That's what you were preoccupied with. So who had the knowledge base in this country? Well, it was inherited the traditions from Europe, of course, and England specifically. And now what I mean is that there is a sort of an upper crust of society that had the luxury of being able to have intellectual thought, to be able to go to school, to be educated. It takes a certain kind of wealth, a certain kind of freedom that can only come with that wealth for you not to have to be working every second of your life just to survive, you see. So naturally, just from the European tradition, we had people who were educated that tended to also be wealthy, you see. And of course, one of the big differences between on this continent in Europe was that if you were born into the aristocracy, you could be a complete moron and still have positions of power, you see. At least in this country, there was always a semblance of some kind of merit thing, where if you could claw your way up from the bottom, well, you made it, even though people would hate you, even if you made it because you didn't belong there, because you weren't one of them. And I take the pains to explain all of this because it has everything to do with Andrew Jackson, everything to do with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the first president, as the seventh president of the United States, where he was literally an outsider. And what made him an outsider was he was not a gentleman. He was not of a gentried past. He didn't have inherited wealth. He had nothing. He started off with absolutely nothing. And he sort of, to use a sort of a worn out term, pulled himself up on his own. And he came from this, I don't want to call it a humble background, but it was a rough and tumble background that gave him what today we would call street smarts or street sensibility, which was considered the opposite of what you wanted in government as a gentleman, you see? And from that standpoint, Andrew Jackson, when he arrived in government, was not just an outcast, he was not welcome because he wasn't one of the what today we would call the cultural elite, you see. And a lot of things changed in those first 50 years, right? In the first 50 years of our country, I mean, when Washington was president, I mean, you couldn't even vote unless you owned land. And not only that, but you could only vote if you owned a certain amount of land. So you can see how exclusionary would be the word we would use today. And I would also say exclusive. And anybody who's part of something exclusive, you kind of like being on the right side of that exclusion, you know? It's kind of like if you're in a special club that doesn't allow those people or those people, I mean, that might make you feel good that you're on the right side of that. You know, I'm not saying you and I, we literally are in a different era, but back in these days, people felt entitled to their entitlement. And so we had kind of like this inherited elitism that we got from Great Britain, etc. And Andrew Jackson is a curious mix in this regard. He did not belong as far as that was concerned. And people who were in government when he came to power rebelled against him because they didn't want him there. It's a fascinating story. And I'm going to go to my slideshow today. Now, the slideshow I had prepared for this was before I decided to take this in the context that I'm taking it today, but it's all right. I'll flip back and forth between some different slides and we'll get the job done. All right. So let me go to my screen share. And hang on a second. There we go. So there's Andrew Jackson, seventh president of the United States. You can see that he's a two-term president. Um, and he was the first president where in a what was to become the norm of the party system as we really have today, right? Today, of course, we have Democrats and Republicans. I mean, the original founding fathers, they kind of were not looking forward to having political parties because they were going to think that it was too divisive, which obviously is. I'm not saying that it's too divisive, but it was sort of this natural evolution. But Andrew Jackson was somebody who was to be the first of what later on, even by 1960 standards, we would call Dixiecrats, right? He was from the South and he was a Democrat. And before then, it was the Democratic Republicans, right? And that kind of fell off, and then the Whig Party fell off. Before long, right? He's in office till 1837. And it wasn't going to take but 10 more years or so, 15 years, where we had the proper Republican Party come out, which aligned itself with the goal of not abolishing slavery, but abolishing the advancement of slavery, which notice the distinction when I said that. We'll talk about that more when we do Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln was the first president on the Republican ticket, right? and literally triggering the Civil War. Um, and so it was Andrew Jackson. As a matter of fact, by the way, a little fun fact, the those mascots of the our two Republican, our two political parties. The Democrat has, of course, the donkey, right? And that was used as a criticism of Andrew Jackson, right? The political cartoons of the day would say that Andrew Jackson was a jackass. And I want you to watch his personality here, the way Andrew Jackson works, right? Andrew Jackson decided to flip that. And today we would call this trolling, right? And he flipped that criticism and he used it against his political opponents. And he welcomed the notion of the moniker of a jackass. And that is literally as him being the first Democrat, that is why the jackass or the donkey, if you will, is the mascot of the Democrat Party. I love little fun facts like that, by the way. I got to figure out where the Republican came from. I mean, the elephant for the other side. Jackson is what we would call today a populist, right? Populism. And populism is something that it is embraced and it's derided, right? And this is where a lot of this overlaps with of our sensibilities today. We've had populists before, but the idea of a populist means that maybe the guy's qualified, maybe he's not qualified. Maybe he's smart, maybe he isn't smart. Maybe he's a gentleman, maybe he's a crude, nasty person, you see, that doesn't have the sensibilities to be somebody in office that we should look up to. But for some reason, people love the guy. That was Andrew Jackson. You see, for some reason, people love him, right? So for all of his detractors who tended to be those more educated from him, more pedigreed for him, and I think that pedigreed is even a more important category than educated because Jackson became educated, you see. The problem here with Andrew Jackson is he didn't have the pedigree. He came from the wrong geographical place in the country. He came from the wrong background, you see. And he just we don't want him here. He's the wrong pedigree, you see. But despite that, people loved him. So the question would be, what makes somebody popular? You see? And that is literally the story of Andrew Jackson. You can see the obvious parallels to, what we've been going through in our own politics. 2 terms. So it wasn't like he was in office and he got thrown out. So here's just a quick timeline of Andrew Jackson's life, right? So I'm just going to go through this and we're going to come back to many of the points here. And we've got an hour and a half today, so we've got time to go a little bit with the commentary and all the rest of that. That's excellent. It's one of the things I like about teaching here is that we have time to put things in more context. So March 15th, 1767, right? Born in Waxhaw, if I'm pronouncing that right. Excuse me if I'm not. South Carolina, which is, this is like they didn't have people with GPS out there. I mean, it was right at the border of South and North Carolina, in a place where you could easily refer to as the wilderness, right? Very, very, very humble beginnings here. And 1767, right? So we're fighting the Civil War, right? When he's a kid, which is to become very, very important here. That's a very important aspect of this. I'll get into it in a minute. Right, 1780 to 1781, he is actually in did I say the Civil War? The Revolutionary War. Beg your pardon. He's in the Revolutionary War as a child. He's 13 years old. But watch what happens here. I'm going to tell you the story of all this in a second. 1787, as a self-taught person, he literally passes the bar exam. He's admitted to the as a lawyer in North Carolina. 1795, is a member of the newly formed states of Tennessee's Constitutional Convention, and then becomes one of the first congressperson to Washington, D.C. from the state of Tennessee. Now, back in these days, Tennessee, incidentally, was the frontier, right? Western Tennessee, that is. It's the frontier. And that's something we also have to remember historically. 1797 to 1798, senator from Tennessee. 1798 to 1804, judge of Tennessee Superior Court. Right now, watch the shift over to military. So 1812 to 1815, he's a major general in the War of 1812, right? Now, this was in the Tennessee State Militia, which it wasn't the same kind of militia you had in the revolutionary times. By this time in the country, it was really, you could only equate it to our National Guard, right? So if you're in the Tennessee National Guard, it's kind of like being in the Army. And if you're doing something for the National Guard, it is on behalf of, I mean, at least what he was doing was on behalf of Washington, D.C. You see? So he's a major general in the War of 1812. And of course, we have to know about the War of 1812, and I'll explain a few things about that as soon as we get to it. 1812, the War of 1812 is something that generally we skip over, don't know much about. And but he becomes famous in the War of 1812. That's where he really becomes a rock star. He would have remained probably, I don't want to say a nobody, but he wasn't going to have the kind of celebrity that he had it not been for what happened with him in the War of 1812. And there are many generals that went on to become presidents, of course, him being one of them. And the reason why we knew them so popularly and trusted them was because of the way we celebrated them for their military victories, etc. And that certainly was the case with Andrew Jackson, right? We had who was it? Washington, Jackson, right? Of course, President Grant was clearly the head of the Union forces towards the second half of the Civil War. And then, of course, more recently, Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, here's something that is a big part of Jackson's legacy. All right, 1817 to 1818, commands the United States troops in the Seminole War in Florida, which becomes the beginning of the overlap into Jackson's involvement with what we should call native peoples, right? Or American Indians or Indians, if you will. I prefer native peoples and or Indians if you want. You see, and this is something that sticks with him, this part of the history, because it is not a pretty part of our history. It is not a pretty part of our history. The treatment of Indians, the um, the personal overlap that Jackson had with Indians during this period of time is probably what gives him like an F if you're looking at him for through the lens of social justice in the year 2024. All right. Now, Florida is where he actually went down and had several incidents with Indians. Um, and Florida back in these days was not a United States territory. It was still belonged to Spain. And as a result of all of this, Spain was um, actually ceded control of Florida, the peninsula of Florida, to the United States. And because of his involvement in this, nobody knew more about Florida than Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson becomes the first governor of the territory of Florida. 1823 to 1825, he goes back to being a senator. 1829 to 1837, the seventh president of the United States. And he dies finally 1845 at the Hermitage, which was the name of his property near Nashville, Tennessee, where he and his wife Rachel are both buried. There is Rachel Donaldson Jackson. This has a very large part of the attitude that Jackson brought not only to life, but to politics, right? I would say that there was no larger influence, not because Mrs. Jackson was telling him what to do. Jackson was somebody who he was a rough and tumble guy. He was a frontier guy. And this is not unusual for back in those days. He was a protector of women, right? He was a protector of women. And what does that mean? It means that you don't insult my wife without expecting to get knocked on your behind. You see? That sort of a thing. And there's several instances where Andrew Jackson, because of either in defense of his wife's virtue or other women's virtue, that Andrew Jackson had conflicts with other people in Washington. He was a big defender. He would not allow a woman to be disparaged the way that people disparaged some women. And I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. So just quickly, Rachel Jackson, I'm going to read this. Rachel Jackson was somebody who was the daughter of an innkeeper out on Western Tennessee. And Jackson had wound up out in Western Tennessee because he kept getting into trouble over in his area where he grew up, etc. He was, kept getting in fights. He was a rough and tumble person. He wouldn't think twice about pulling his pistol, this sort of a thing. And to clean up his reputation, he literally went, with the old adage, go west. He literally went as far as west as you could, where literally nobody knew him. And therefore, basically, nobody knew who you were, so they didn't know your past. You could start afresh. And he was in Western Tennessee, which was, like I said to you, that was the frontier back in the days. And he is there to meet a friend of his who lives there, who's going to help him with his career. And he's already a lawyer at this point. And he goes into the rooming house, and there's a woman there who's the daughter of the innkeeper, and he's immediately smitten. And she's smitten to him. They just kind of hit it off. The problem is that Rachel Jackson is already married. She's already married. And you'll forgive me, I forgot the name of her husband. But it was not a good marriage. The guy was abusive. And then she forced what was, I guess, what you could call like a form of separation, right? So she went and she stayed with her mother now, and he was, heaven knows where he was, right? He was local, but far enough away not to be in her hair. If this was modern times, she would have gotten a restraining order on him and filed for divorce. Back in those days, of course, a woman had no such privileges. And your husband had to be the one to initiate and follow up with a divorce, you see. So this becomes a situation between Rachel Jackson, um, and of course, Andrew Jackson, because he can't pursue her because she's already married, right? But the marriage is all but gone So they have this awkward period of time where they know each other, and it's kind of like two people that know that they're meant for each other, but they can't do anything about it. So word comes that the husband has agreed to give her a divorce and that he is going to go, and I don't know, I think you had to go to the city to do it or some such thing, wherever the city was, and he is going to go get a divorce. So from that standpoint, Rachel Jackson and Andrew Jackson, they carry on as though they're free agents now, right? They cohabitate, they literally eventually get married. And the problem here is that the husband never got the divorce. Okay. He never actually got the divorce. So now you can see the way this sets up. It sets up that now she is literally married to two men at the same time, and the virtue of a woman is completely destroyed in this regard. She's the worst kind of you add adjective here as you choose. And remember, this is a long time ago. This is 1767, you see, and you couldn't have a bigger slander against a woman, particularly, and secondarily to a man that loves her. And that was the situation now that Andrew Jackson and Rachel Jackson were in. To make a long story short, eventually the husband did get the divorce and it was finalized. And then publicly, Rachel and Andrew Jackson got married. So, they literally got married twice. But the stigma of this situation was permanent and never went away. So Rachel, it says, a beautiful woman, grew up on a plantation and lived part of her life on the frontier. She married young, but the unhappy couple separated and she moved in with her mother, where Andrew Jackson was a boarder. There was an immediate attraction and they married as Rachel believed she was divorced, but it had not yet been finalized. Years later, during Jackson's 1828 campaign for the presidency, Rachel's virtue was questioned by John Quincy Adams. Right? That's an understatement. There was a tremendous scandal about all of this. While Jackson won the presidency, Rachel's health declined, and she died before he took office. Jackson believed the attacks by his political enemies contributed to her death. Now, from everything I've read about this, I mean, that seemed perfectly plausible to me. She fell into what, retrospectively, I would say it was a deep depression. It wrecked her, right? She loved him, and what Jackson had a lot of political enemies, and they took Rachel and they used her to try to get to Jackson. In other words, if you can make this guy's wife miserable enough and impugn her and by saying, what kind of value system do these two have? And we can't have that kind of value system in the White House. It's a matter of morals, you see. And they literally, I think it's fair to say that they killed her. And you want to talk about motivations and things that don't go away as far as um, axis to grind that a person winds up having towards others. Andrew Jackson never forgave anybody for what happened to his beloved wife, right? You see, Andrew Jackson was somebody by the time he actually won the presidency, he was so angry of so many people that literally, as we would say today, he had a list of retribution, you see, because he wanted to get back at people who had attacked his family or had wronged him personally or professionally. You see, now, as far as I'm concerned, there bears certain parallels, right or wrong, deserved or not, to some of our current day politics. So um, another thing that happened with Andrew Jackson, it's mentioned here that he wins the 1828 presidency. But he ran for office in 1824, right? And what happens is that he loses to John Quincy Adams, right? And there's this guy who's an arch enemy of his also, Jackson's that is, in the Congress, right, called Henry Clay. And the election of 1824 was a contested election. It was a contested election. And Andrew Jackson was in a position where who was going to win, whether it be John Quincy Adams or he, had to be decided literally by the Congress, right? It was one of these things where it got flipped to the Congress. And as it turns out, John Quincy Adams made a deal with Henry Clay, who was in a position of influence in the Congress, to make the adjudication, or whatever you want to call it, about who actually won this election. And uh, Henry Clay pushed his influence, and John Quincy Adams won the election. And then Henry Clay wound up with a plum position in the John Quincy Adams administration. You see? So as far as Andrew Jackson was concerned, he got totally screwed out of the presidency. You see? And he had 4 years to literally get his act in a row, get people behind him, figure out a game plan where he was going to win overwhelmingly. Does any of this sound familiar? Right? And it's just fascinating to me, some of the parallels. Like I said, I'm not taking a position, I'm just pointing out some historical facts, you see? And so between what happened to Rachel Jackson, which actually was after what I just said to you, and what happened with his political enemies, and the fact that he got, in his opinion, screwed out of the presidency in a very corrupt faction, by the time he actually won the presidency in 1828, decisively, he had brought with him what today the word we would use would be mandate, you see, and say that I am going to come in and I am going to clean up the corruption. I am going to get rid of these people who screwed me. I'm going to make sure that the people I put around me aren't going to screw me. In other words, today we would call that we would put people who are loyal to us, you see. And that is just some of the parallels of the criticisms of Andrew Jackson and the way things happened and the way he got to the White House finally in 1828 and this axe he had to grind. And the fact that he had been beaten up so badly, he felt, by the establishment gave him a certain kind of moral high ground to go in there and just do what the hell he wanted to do anyway because everybody already hated him. It's very fascinating, right? This is 1828 or 1824, the first time around. Oh, here's a great story. You want to talk about, we talked about Andrew Jackson being a general in the War of 1812, which of course was against the British. And well, Andrew Jackson hated the British. See, this was his first real trauma in his life that isn't going to leave him, that is going to leave him with a lifelong feeling. All right, here's the feeling. During the Revolutionary War, as we had that list before, he is 13 years old. There he is depicted in this, painting or whatever this is, in blue. He's 13 years old. Now, by this point in the war, his older brother, he's got two brothers, or had two brothers. His older brother has already been killed in the fighting of the Revolutionary War at the hands of the British, right? So his older brother has already perished, right? Incidentally, Andrew Jackson never met his father. And I forgot to mention that. He never met his father. His father died before he was born. He never met his father, right? So his father's gone. His older brother's gone now at the hands of the British, which leaves him and his brother. Now, him and his brother are there, and they are what are called runners in the Revolutionary War. Now, what a runner is, we had runners right up to, World War II, where an army or a commander would hand a message to a runner, and you would run it to another trench line or to another place And you would usually need three or four runners because chances are three of them would get killed, right? Just before we had radios or anything else like that, or any kind of instant communication. So they had to be delivered manually. And kids were a good way to do it in the revolution. He gets captured. He and his brother, who's with him, gets captured by the British, right? Which isn't that unusual. Now, the British were notorious for having these, inhospitable ways of keeping captives, right? I mean, if you ever heard of some of the prison ships we had in the Hudson River, we had American colonists who were fighting the British who got captured, and they were put in these rat-infested, disease-ridden, lice-ridden ships with like nothing to eat, no nutrition, no clean water, and people died from sickness. And that was very, very common back in these days. And I know probably not just the British. I mean, I'm sure that every single prison environment was similar, right? And but what happens here is young Andrew Jackson gets captured, and this British officer looks down upon him, right, from this aristocratic way. Besides the fact that the power differential between their ages and the fact that he's a prisoner and this guy is the captor, and he demands that young Andrew Jackson shine his boots. Now, this sounds like a small thing, but like I said to you, I'm a psychology person, and these things are very, very important in somebody's formation, their formative thinking, right? Andrew Jackson is, no, I'm not shining your boots. And the officer, feels like he's going to treat Andrew Jackson to a lesson now, draws his sword to strike Andrew Jackson, which he does, leaving a permanent scar on his skull for the rest of his life. Now, right at this moment, Andrew Jackson despises the British, right? And it wasn't to end there either. So, Andrew Jackson and his brother are languishing in some prison. And because they're so young, they actually last longer than other people whose, immune systems have already succumbed to malnutrition, and unsanitary drinking water and other conditions, right? And Andrew Jackson has really the first hero in his life, and that is his mother. Andrew Jackson's mother, on foot, goes all the way out to this prison camp, and she begs and pleads for the British to release her two young children, right? And the British don't want to do it, and Andrew Jackson's mother has to do it. She has to work on it, and she pleads with them. She implores them to release her children, and you know what? They finally do. I don't know why they did, but they did. And Andrew Jackson and his brother now are headed back out to wherever they live. And they have to go, of course, this is one of these things where they're going through the woods in the middle of the night. And Andrew Jackson's brother is actually much worse off than Andrew Jackson is. He's sick already. He has one of these respiratory diseases. He's dying, right? He's a teenager and he's dying. And Andrew Jackson, before they get home, Andrew Jackson and his mother have to tend to this dying young boy who then succumbs to his illness and dies. So Andrew Jackson now has lost two brothers at the hands of the British. And that cements in his mind a lifelong hatred of them, right? Not, I mean, the way the treatment of the British, and everything else like that. The British had a certain kind of this aristocratic haughtiness as far as Andrew Jackson was concerned, that he translated that into anybody in positions of power who were haughty. who felt entitled, who felt like they were better than you. And you can see how that actually carried into some of the situations he was in, even when he went to Washington. And people obviously weren't British, but they had that same kind of upper crusty attitude towards the lowlier people. Andrew Jackson, he couldn't tolerate it. And it's, from a psychological standpoint, psycho-emotional standpoint, this is very, very important as far as a formative issue. And at the same time, of course, the big hero in Andrew Jackson's life is his beloved mother. I mean, geez, I mean, what else could you possibly ask for a mother? And then by the end of the war, Andrew Jackson's mother passes away. Now the guy's an orphan. He's literally an orphan, right? He had a father, he had a mother. He had a father he never met, a mother, right? Two brothers, and he's an orphan. He's the only survivor. Here's a portrait. He's got good hair, Andrew Jackson. Which one? The president. Somebody with good hair, right? And look at that collar. Isn't that something? I don't know if that's an exaggeration or maybe it's not. Now, we did this when we did the program on President Monroe, which is one of the programs we did for Edith Wheeler, I don't know, 2 or 3 presentations ago. And bearing his name, the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. This is to really affect the attitude of the United States in relation to, number one, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, right? And to all of the countries that were the original colonial powers in Europe, right? And what the United States wanted to do with the Monroe Doctrine, and this is really very nervy for a country that's barely 50 years old, okay? Is we looked at Great Britain, we looked at France, we looked at Spain, Portugal to a lesser degree, and said, all of you countries that have your flags planted around the world in these empires, the Western Hemisphere is now off limits to you. That's it. And what that means is that anything that happens in the United States or in Canada or in Central America or in South America is going to have to pass muster with the political priorities of the United States, right? So in other words, the age of exploration is over. And it's pretty nervy stuff for a country that's only been around for 50 years to tell countries that have been around for like, many hundreds of years to basically say, well, we've achieved a level of power here and a level of confidence that it's not business as usual anymore. All right, so this affects the attitude of everything in the Americas in the form of what we would generally call manifest destiny, right? Manifest destiny was meant that, I don't know, to me, it's like an aberration of the authority that God must be given us. You see, I mean, because we're here now, we're white, European, Christian people here in this continent, and we are now, this is our greatest hope of having the best kind of the best society that the world has ever produced, right? It's kind of like Europe without the politics, right? It's Europe without the class system. And then so all of our people here on this continent that are lesser people than us, right? Exhibit A would be the Indians. Well, you're just going to have to move over and make room for us, right? So when we talk about, I mean, today, of course, we have a lot of sensibility, a lot of pushback over our history, and and perhaps you've ever been to an event where the event is started or the meeting is started by it's called a land acknowledgement, and saying, I just want to express that we're here on land that was wrongfully taken by whatever Indian tribe or entity actually held possession of this before it was removed from them by us. Right. But back in these days over here, I mean, it was considered, well, we deserve it and we're going to take it. And anybody who doesn't match our way of doing things, right? Well, we have a higher sense of entitlement than you do, essentially because we're better than you are. There's no real way to spin this any other way than it is. So, um, and of course, another thing here is that the United States is even growing. The southern half of the United States is, well, of course, it's an agrarian culture, you see, and that agrarian culture is based on slave labor. Right? And slave labor is something that was considered as is an extension of what I was just talking about. Was, all right, so what's the problem with this? And we had a lot of abolitionists, and even some in the South, and most of them in the North. And the abolitionists were saying, hey, I don't know if you noticed, but this is like kind of immoral. I don't think it's in the Bible anywhere where it's kind of like we're owning other people, even though slavery is in the Bible, basically, but they're all white slaves. But the kind of slavery we had during this era, and it wasn't invented in the United States, um, but it was basically racially based, you see. So, that is black people. And the Southern states and Andrew Jackson, being a Southerner, he had no problem with this whatsoever. And the fascinating thing about Jackson, maybe it's not fascinating, maybe that's not the right word, is that he's a smart guy. But one of the differences between him and the people who came before him, particularly the real thinkers, Jefferson, Madison, right? Even Washington to a degree, right? It was that, these guys, they stopped and they thought about things philosophically. And philosophically, like Jefferson is probably the best example here, the best counterpoint to Jackson. Jefferson, the man who wrote the words, all men are created equal, understood clearly the obvious the obvious irony that slavery was permitted in the United States. Of course, Jefferson included a phrase in the Declaration of Independence based on the fact that all men were created equal and endowed by their creator, right, etc. That since that is true, then we're getting rid of slavery, But the thing is, with the Declaration of Independence, is it had to be a unanimous document signed by all 13 colonies, or else it would have no teeth. So to be able to get it signed by all 13 colonies, including the southern colonies, that clause about getting rid of slavery had to be removed. But the point is that Jefferson at least thought about these things, was conflicted about these things. Jackson, not so much. Jackson, not so much. Slavery is here, and not only that, but when Jackson finally was able to own his own land, which is a way that you actually showed in this country that you were somebody and could be trusted because you had land, which was really the only kind of property that should be respectfully understood as something to be owned, you know. Um, Jackson had no problem with the fact that he owned slaves. None whatsoever. You see? None whatsoever. Now, whether that means he's a racist or, I mean, Jefferson had slaves too, so you could technically say he must have been a racist also, But my point to you is that at least Jefferson thought about it. I mean, Jackson had no problem with it whatsoever, and that carried over to his feelings about the Native Americans also. I mean, it was literally like just something that needed to be moved, right? Almost practically like an inanimate object, So by today's standpoint, that is like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't compute, right? Certainly to somebody like me, because I look at people as individuals and I'm like, well, that's a person, you see, but here is a position of time and a Southern sentiment that this is the way society is done down here. Right. So, if you had an escaped slave, I mean, it was big business to have somebody go and get that slave. I want to show you something here. Right. This is an actual advertisement written by the subscriber. The subscriber happens to be, if you look at the bottom, Andrew Jackson, right, near Nashville. And I don't have to read this whole thing here, but it's interesting and it's written in Old English, and you'll bear with me because I always screw this up because in the Old English the F's are S's and vice versa. So and I trip up. Okay, but that being said, stop the runaway, $50 reward. Now, by the way, $50 must have been a pretty nice sum of money back in them days. $50 reward. So eloped from the subscriber, that being Andrew Jackson, living near Nashville on the 25th of June last, a mulatto manslave, about 30 years old, 6 feet and an inch high, stout made and active, talks sensible, stoops in his walk, and has a remarkable large foot brought across the root of the toes, will pass for a free man. I am informed he has obtained by some means certificates as such, took with him a drab great coat, dark mixed body coat, a ruffled shirt, cotton homespun shirtwaist or shirt band, and overalls. He will make for Detroit through the states of Kentucky and Ohio or the upper parts of Louisiana. The above reward will be given to any person that will take him and deliver him to me or secure him to a jail so that I can get him. Now listen to this. If taken out of the state, the above reward and all reasonable expenses paid, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him to the amount of 300. Now, there it is. Uh, Additionally to the slavery thing, um, so Treaty of Fort Jackson, 1814. As it turns out, there's nobody who knows more about dealing with Indians on the frontier than Andrew Jackson. This happens practically, I wouldn't say it's by accident. He is ordered as an officer of the Tennessee militia to go down to Florida and solve a problem. Here's the problem. The problem is that Florida is in Spanish territory, and there are Indians coming out of what today we would refer to this as a terrorist base, right? And so in other words, the Indians who are doing these terrorist raids out of Florida and actually pillaging homes, etc., to try to get settlers for think twice about settling on the frontier in Georgia, Alabama, etc. You see? Now, as far as the federal government was concerned, our federal government, this had to stop. I mean, it was literally a tax upon our citizens. And so that meant that Andrew Jackson was going to have to go into literally a foreign country, Florida, right? And actually go to a hostile camp while these Indians were being hosted. Who were they being hosted by? Well, it turns out they were being hosted by the British. You see, so in other words, in order to harass us, the British were actually supplying these Indians and promising the Indians all kinds of stuff, right? Land and people like the British were using the sensibilities of the Indians who hated the colonists, not the colonists, but the United States citizens at this point in the federal government from driving them off their lands, which they would be which was happening. And the British were saying, well, if you work for us, we'll help you get your land back. Now that was a lie. The British weren't going to do that and didn't do that, but it was no more of a lie than everything we told the Indians too. You see, not that makes any of it good. It isn't. The point here is that Andrew Jackson literally leads it's like SEAL Team 6. without the hardware. You have to literally sneak into another country and actually rout these Indians who are at this secret base. And in the process, they're being hosted by the British, who were not at war at this particular moment. And in the process of this, Andrew Jackson takes two of the British guys, charges them with being spies, right? Or treasonous or something, and he has them executed outside of his own authority. I mean, the whole thing practically creates an international incident, you see? So the guy is obviously brave. You could also say that he's kind of reckless. And you would also say, his critics would say, well, the guy's got an ego on him and he's just trying to be famous, and I'm not in a position to actually to talk anybody out of that last thought. And then, of course, this Indian thing was to have two aspects of it, first and second. Okay, that was the first one, and then in between you actually have the Battle of New Orleans, right? General Andrew Jackson, standing on the parapet of his makeshift defenses as his troops repulse attacking Highlanders, British Highlanders, by painter Percy Moran in 1910, right? So of course, he's very handsome in his uniform, and this is, I don't know. You either find this patriotic or you see it as blatant propaganda, depending on your point of view, right? But that being said, this is what makes Andrew Jackson famous. This is what makes him a household name around the country, right? Because the defenders of New Orleans, which was him, um, they were greatly outnumbered by the British in the War of 1812, where this was to take place. And meanwhile, he was cunning enough and he was smart enough and he was a good enough strategizer to actually lay a series of defensive positions and literally not only defeat the British, but to defeat them soundly, right? So now we have this, once again, we have the emotional story of us being the underdog against this giant army, right? With all of these resources. And because we were smarter than them, we beat them, you see, and not just beat them, but beat them resoundingly. You see, so that is what makes Andrew Jackson a household name. And, it just goes to show you how smart the Americans are and all the rest of that. And as it turns out, the Battle of New Orleans, it was critical to win because had the British taken the mouth of the Mississippi, then the British wanted to come down from the north, and they literally would have controlled, they would have given them a tremendous amount of control, having control of the Mississippi River. Um, Now, ironically, as it turns out, when this particular battle was fought, the War of 1812 had already ended, right? But as things go, nobody knew that. It wasn't like your Andrew Jackson standing there and he reaches in his pocket and pulls out his smartphone, his iPhone 16, and says, "Whoa, the war's over. Let's go have a donut." It wasn't like that. I mean, this happened all the time back in those days. Wars would end. Certainly, if you were a naval officer at sea, you didn't know the war was over. And that's what happened here. The war had been treated. What was the name of that treaty? The Treaty of Ghent, which I think is in, where's Ghent? The Netherlands, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that one. And it was already signed. The war's over. But meanwhile, of course, Jackson doesn't know it. And they fight the battle. And he's victorious. So it's a big deal. A really big deal. It's what puts him on the map and makes him one of those generals to the stature of the other generals we talked about who later became president. Um, yeah, trial of Robert Arbrister, who was one of the British guys, right? And one of the two British subjects executed by General Jackson, right, in Florida. That was what I was telling you about. This was the one that literally creates a national incident, international incident. This is similar to his depiction, of course, on the $20 bill, right? And the fact that Jackson's on the $20 bill probably puts him. One irony is that one of the things that he went to Washington to do when he finally went to become president is he wanted to eradicate the monetary system that was in place, right? He hated paper money. He hated the large banks that had been instituted by his predecessors. And because he felt that they were a source of corruption and a source of laundering money and washing money to the point. It's in other words, when you have a bill, right, a paper bill, what that means is that like maybe it's worth $1 and maybe it's not worth $1. You know, it's as soon as we went to Federal Reserve notes later on, and then like I don't know if any of you have seen a silver certificate, but it basically says pay to the bearer on demand like $1, right? Which means automatically that this dollar represents a dollar in hard currency. In other words, silver or gold in like Fort Knox or wherever the hell I used to keep it. You see? And but as soon as you got to a Federal Reserve note, it's like, well, yeah, it says $1, but the value of $1 now is inflationary and deflationary. And like maybe it's worth $1 and maybe it's not worth $1, right? So anybody in the last few years who's gone to the supermarket, you know, and you've noticed that the same thing, just the $100 that you have to spend is buying you less and less and less, would understand that. I'm not taking aim at anybody here. I'm just, you know, that's happened in various positions of my life as far as time's concerned. I mean, I remember when I was a kid and Jimmy Carter was in office and, you know, how much it cost to get a mortgage and all the rest of that. Not that I was buying a mortgage as a child, but I remember um, inflation, you know. So he hated all of that. He felt as though Andrew Jackson felt this is a big deal. He literally, when he got to office in 1828, he went in to say, you people, you elites, you intellectuals, what you all you've done is create a gigantic crony system where the money is literally being washed around and nobody knows where the hell it is, and there's no accountability because you've created a monetary system that cannot be tracked, it cannot be controlled. Nobody knows where the hell the money is or where it's going. Right. Now, whether that was then or it's now, okay, it literally, the sentiment is the same. I don't think that anybody today would suggest that we should get rid of paper money, right? I mean, frankly, we're past all of that now anyway. Is we'll probably be using by the time, you know, before I'm gone, I'll probably be using Bitcoin and other various things. I mean, I hardly use paper money as it is now, or certainly coinage. And you know, I just use things. I just run my card and have it immediately debited out of my bank account, you know. But for as far as he's concerned, I mean, it's kind of an irony that he's on the $20 bill. Now, as far as changing money is concerned, as far as whose faces this is going to be on money, if the United States government ever gets around to taking off certain faces on money like his will probably be the face first to go for the reasons why by today's sensibilities, um, you know, the thing about the Indians. And of course, the thing about slavery, right? So I have a prediction. I think that probably Andrew Jackson will be replaced by Harriet Tubman, right? Just right. There's my 2 cents on that one. Yeah, Mrs. Calhoun. Mrs. Calhoun is another one. See, back in these days, back in these days, there was the men's world and then there was the women's world, right? And women were important, but they were important in the realm of women, right? That was it. And so Rachel Jackson, as a senator's wife, let alone the presidency, which she never got to be the first lady, because of the scandals involved in this, you know, the accusation of bigamy, etc. People used Andrew Jackson's enemies to exclude him from Washington, to hurt him personally, to hurt his campaigns. To get to Andrew Jackson, they constantly bashed Rachel Jackson. They used her as a target to get to him. You see? They slandered him and her. Now he could take it, but she couldn't. She was more, I don't know. I don't want to use the word delicate. It's wrong. I don't want to make that sound like it's stereotypical towards women, you know? Mrs. Calhoun was a wife of one of the prominent people in Washington, and doing the bidding of her husband. She was the head of the social circle of all of the proper social society functions and the women involved. And she made sure that Rachel Jackson was completely blacklisted from absolutely everything. This is one of the things that sent Rachel Jackson into a deep depression, which, according to Jackson, and I'm not in a position to argue this, killed her by the time of his inauguration as president. And it's just a really tragic story. And, so we're still in an age where we use people's families and we use anything we can to create enough attrition on our opponent to cause them either to go out of business or to lose the fire in the stomach to run for office, to just to make you go away. We are going to make you pay a price. And Andrew Jackson paid the price. And he never forgot any of them for killing his wife as he saw it. Indian territories. There's something called the Indian Removal Act of 1930, which bears Andrew Jackson's name, right? Not that the Indian Removal Act of 1830 has his name in it. I mean, it bears his name as far as historical memory is concerned. And he literally, this is what was to be called the Trail of Tears, right? And it can't be made anything than what it is, no matter what your sensibilities are on this. I mean, from any person in the postmodern era like we are in, it's, I don't want to call this the Bataan Death March, but what would you call it? This is you're taking people from areas that we don't want them anymore, opening it up to white Christian settlement. And you're literally telling the Indians that you just got to go to these designated places we have placed, and that's it. We're not asking you. We don't want to know what your opinion is. Pack your stuff and go. And a gazillion people died along the way and all the rest of this. And like I said to you, it can't be made, and you can't turn this into something other than what it is. And this is probably the most damaging part of Jackson's legacy. Not to say that if somebody else was in his position, they wouldn't have done the exact same thing. I mean, there's a limit to how much we can take ourselves and put ourselves in other people's minds or transport ourselves. One of the problems with just doing this kind of history to begin with is something called presentism, where we're just walking into situations like this. And I find this to be an extreme one. And saying, well, if that was me, I wouldn't do that. Well, you don't know that. If you were raised in the same particular period of time and and you were a person of that era with the same kind of experiences and sensibilities and politics, how do you know you wouldn't have done the exact same thing? Grave portrait of Andrew Jackson. I'm pretty sure that's the picture that was used for the one on the $20 bill. This one over here, 1833 Democratic cartoon showing Jackson destroying the Devil's Bank. And like I said to you, the big thing, see, now Jackson comes into office finally, and what he's done, he's coming in with a mandate to literally destroy the institutions of Washington, right? Which is something else that also might sound familiar to you. You see, he's going to come in and he's so damn angry anyway. I mean, because he feels as though he's been so beat up. His wife is dead. They've thrown everything that they can at him. They never liked him anyway. Okay. And there he is, despite their efforts to destroy him every way that he can be destroyed. He is coming in and he's saying, I am going to wipe out the entire status quo in Washington. All of you people who are in Congress, you're corrupt. You're corrupt because this revolving door with the monetary system here, you're getting rich off of the things that Congress is doing. You're putting money into this monetary system. The federal government is spending money on it. The money disappears, and all of a sudden people are getting rich, you see? And I am going to come and I am going to, I mean, if this was now, they would have said, I'm going to drain the swamp. You see? That's another thing about Jackson. And of course, all of the people who are involved in that status quo wanted to remain the status quo. So what they're doing is they're putting all kinds of resistive measures in to make sure that Jackson can't do it and all the rest of this. And you have this tremendous fight. And he actually is able to do it. And Jackson is the first president to come in and actually take command as the president and say, I, as the president, are going to do this. Jackson's really the first person who is at this long line of what we're used to now. It's like when President Biden came in and he signed a stack of executive orders. And now I assume that when President Trump takes office, he's going to have a similar stack of executive orders, right? Jackson is the first one who was actually, without the term executive order, is actually doing things as the executive branch by the authority of the executive branch. He's the first one to start this tradition, if you want to call it. Add word here. Another fun fact, Andrew Jackson is the first president of the United States to survive two assassination attempts. The first one. And in this case, you've got this person who was found to be mentally ill, whatever the term of it, the criteria for mentally ill was back in those days from 1835. And you've got somebody here who comes with with one of these long coats, approaches Jackson, and this is before we have Secret Service protection. And he pulls out gosh, I don't even know what gun kind of, I was it a flintlock gun or a revolver? I'm afraid I don't know. I'm sorry, but he pulls out a gun and at point blank range goes to shoot Jackson, which would have killed him, and the gun misfired. And Jackson now, Jackson's walking around with lead in his body, by the way, because he's been shot himself before, but in battle and various other things. The guy's been in duels before. And he actually is so enraged by this person who just shot at him, right, or tried to shoot at him, that Jackson has a cane and he walks over, he takes his cane and he rushes over to these assailant and starts beating this guy and almost practically beats him to death, right? And this guy shakes them off, and then the guy pulls out another gun and pulls the trigger at point blank range, and that gun misfires too. It's unbelievable. Two assassination attempts. I'm just going to have to skip through some of this. We've only got 10 minutes left. I wanted to go wider on this today and see if I could put it in as much context as possible, because it's absolutely fascinating, some of the parallels to today and what made Jackson who he was, right? This is now by the end of Jackson's life, right? We have photography, right? Which is cool for somebody like me because now I don't have to show you drawings or paintings. This is an actual photograph in 1845 of Andrew Jackson. Pretty cool. That's a nice painting, right? I mean, I guess if you're going to hire somebody to paint you, right, they can make him, he was supposed to, so now he's a country gentleman, which was always the aspiration. See, maybe people who grew up on the outside or lived on the outside, it's always their dream to be part of that gentry. And 1831 from the collection of the Hermitage, right? A lot of stamps. I mean, Jackson is somebody who is well received as far as imagery in the United States government, right? There was a 2-cent stamp from 1863. There's a stamp from 1870. Here's a stamp from 1903 commemorating the life of Jackson. Obviously, the $20 bill. Here's a statue of Jackson. I assume this is still there, right? Kansas City, Missouri. This was commissioned by Judge Harry Truman, right? And there's also a statue of Jackson in the park across from the White House. This is the burial place of at the Hermitage of Jackson and his wife. The tomb of Andrew and Rachel Donaldson Jackson, located at their home in the Hermitage. Here's another tearjerker point. The dress that Rachel was going to wear to the inauguration of her husband, since she died right before he was inaugurated, she's buried in the inauguration dress. Of course, the state of Florida seal with the Seminole Indians, etc. There's a stamp. Oh, I'm just going to fly through this. We're out of time anyway. But Andrew Jackson was the only president to erase the national debt. I don't know how the hell he did that. I'm going to have to study that. But Andrew Jackson felt so strongly that we should not be a debtor nation, right? That we shouldn't be in debt, rather, not a debtor. We shouldn't be, if you are in debt, then that means that you are a prisoner, right? If you owe money, it means that you can't do what you want. You lose your freedom. You lose your freedom in foreign policy. You lose your freedom in domestic policy. And he was the only one to ever pay off the national debt. For those of you who are wondering if we have a national debt now, well, just Google it. I think that you will find it's almost $36 trillion. So we spend more money on our entire national defense every year. No, about the same amount of money that we spend on national defense every single year, the Navy, the Army, etc., as we do an equal amount of money just to pay the interest on how much national debt we have, right? So I don't see either I mean, either political party is actually saying, you know what I'm going to do when I get into office? We're going to erase the national debt. Not that anybody's going to do that, right? But it's the ways to get to that or is just as interesting as this. Andrew Jackson, by the time he was president, we talk about the people who came before him. And I think a fascinating presentation or even series of presentations would be that of the difference between the policy or the ideology, if you will, and the policies that follow it between a Thomas Jefferson and an Alexander Hamilton, right? Alexander Hamilton felt like we should have a stronger centralized government, and the centralized government should be in charge of more things and be in charge of, carrying a debt and actually having a stimulus, giving money and then creating, that's going to create more revenue, as opposed to Jefferson's point of view, which is we shouldn't do any of that. Either you owe money or you don't owe money. And so it's fascinating stuff. And he's talking about that people in government, essentially, just to boil it down, it's just that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And people, as far as Andrew Jackson was concerned, people in government were already getting fat and happy, and they were already having their status quo. And the powerful, they use government to line their pockets, etc. And he felt as though it is their job, his job, to clean that out. Martin Van Buren. The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. He is the first one to actually, and this was something that was considered unconstitutional at the time. Something came across his desk as far as the National Bank was concerned, and he refused to sign it. And it was called a pocket veto. It was the first time it was done. So, in other words, I'm not signing this damn thing, and the whole thing failed anyway, just because it couldn't be approved because he actually wouldn't sign it, right? And he was the first. This was considered an abuse of executive power at that time. Heaven will be no heaven to me if I do not meet my wife there. He really loved her. Right. So here is President Andrew Jackson on the closing of the Second Bank of the United States, which he was able to successfully do. It was unbelievable. I have had men watching you for a long time, and I am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits among you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You were a den of vipers and thieves. This is literally how he came to Washington during his presidency. I am going to come in there. I am going to take this organization apart. I'm going to clean house. I'm going to root out the corruption. And I could do this for another hour. There's so much. Anyway, like I said, the hour and a half went by fast. It is virtually 3 o'clock. Um, and I don't know if your mics are on or not, but if you have any questions, just pass them along, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. I'm glad, so happy that you were able to share this discussion with me. Not that it was a discussion, I was doing all the talking, but thank you for inviting me to speak and for joining me. All right, I will see you next week, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation. All right, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to go. All right, thank you so much. Take care of yourselves. Right, bye bye.